Hello. I want to just take a moment to thank the Public Policy Forum. I want to I want to acknowledge the elder who spoke earlier. Thank you for your beautiful words. I want to acknowledge the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people on the land that we stand. And I want to thank my son, who's been a lifelong inspiration for me, for coming with me tonight. I just want to say, I feel like I'm really short and I can, there we go. I want to say, I know that this award tonight is not just all about me. I've somehow become a face for Indigenous journalism, and I'm very grateful to receive it. But there are so many people who have contributed along the way to the success of APTN. We started out with probably about 12 reporters. In the beginning, my beat was to cover Ontario, Quebec, Nunavut, and Northwest Territories. We didn't necessarily have vehicles or cell phones. I once famously hitchhiked out and back to a community that was about 500 miles away. It took a couple of days, but we got the story done. Along the way, we've built into about a crew of 65 news staff, and I think the reason I'm standing here today is a lot on their backs. I want to thank some of the people who came before me. Dan David, the father of APTN National News, who gave it a vision. Rita Deverell, the only non-native to ever leave the newsroom, who organized us and taught us a lot about journalism. Vera Houle, who was the longest-lasting news director before I came on. And I really need to thank Jean Larose, our CEO. He's great. He comes and he supports the newsroom when he can, and I like the perfect CEO. He stays out of the newsroom the rest of the time. It's largely on his back that when we've been fighting for cases of press freedom, like the recent Justin Brake win, it's been because Jean Larose has supported it. I wanted to say something inspirational, and I'm sure I'm just the facts ma'am kind of person. And so I was trying to think of somebody who is inspirational to me. And I thought about who is my favorite Native writer, and it's Thomas King. He says the truth about stories is that that's all that we are. And that's true. If you want to tell somebody something about yourself, you're going to tell them a story. And in that story, they're going to know what you're proud of, what embarrasses you, and maybe a little something more about who you love and what's important. He had a series of essays in the Massey lectures, and I just want to take a phrase out of that tonight. Every time he finished one of his Massey lectures, he'd say, "Take this story. It's yours. Do with it what you will. Tell it to friends. Turn it into a movie. Forget about it. But don't say in the years to come you would have lived your life differently if you'd heard the story, because you've heard it now." So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. I'm not one for speeches, but I am a storyteller. If you've known me for any length of time, you've probably heard me talk about Olive Patricia Dickinson. She was a woman who in 1970, the year that I was born, went into university and said that she wanted to study Native history. And they told her she couldn't because there was no such thing. She found a professor who would take her on so that she could create Native history because it didn't exist before, and that was something new. You see, before she became a historian, she was a journalist, and I think she realized that there was something missing, something wrong in the fact that we weren't included in Canadian history. Oh, sure, we're there in the beginning where we're adding to the narrative of building Canadian history, but the minute the fur trade is over, we disappear, and maybe show up around Expo 67 and start asking for some rights. But this is where we go wrong. We have two separate histories. We have Canadian history and the Native history that she invented, and we have two separate journalisms, Canadian journalism and Native journalism. How are they two separate things? Do we really believe that Canadian history happened separately and without us, and we didn't impact each other and share our lives and share our stories? When I started at APTN, I started in 2000. I was just out of school. So along with that big area they asked me to cover, I also got to cover Parliament Hill, which is something that most reporters wait their entire life for. I got lost up there a lot. Some of those hallways are a little confusing. I went into an Aboriginal Affairs Committee meeting, and it was the first meeting of the year, and I just wanted to see what was going on. And there were all the MPs who had been appointed to the committee, and some person from Indian Affairs had come in to explain to them who Métis people are, who Inuit people are, and who First Nations people are, and the difference between status and non-status, and on-reserve and off-reserve, and big Métis and little Métis. And they were all very confused, and they all took good notes, and they were all very sincere. But it was at that moment that I realized the most basic things about our people had to be explained to the people who are going to be making the biggest decisions that affect our lives. And that's the gap. And that's the gap that APTN needed to fill. So we tell stories, and some of the stories are hard. Some of my reporters have been shot with rubber bullets, they've been tear gassed, and they've been pepper sprayed, myself among them. They do it for lower pay and less resources than other reporters. And it's always been that way. Dan David, our original father of news, told us the one thing that we couldn't do is we couldn't fail. 20 years ago, if we failed, we would have been a stereotype. So today, like every other news outlet, our little not-for-profit news outlet is facing some changes. The industry is precarious, and we don't know if we're going to be around. It becomes that much more important for all media to share stories and for coming together to happen. But none of this is really the hard part on my reporters. The hard part is when they're covering child suicide, child welfare, children being taken away from their families, when they're hearing the stories of missing women and their families over and over again, or the fallout for residential schools, alcoholism and addiction. I sometimes say if you don't have post-traumatic stress disorder 3 years into this job, you probably haven't been doing it right. So if you know our history, it really didn't have to be like this. And I'll say everything's become so damn politicized. Listen, this is not an issue that you need to politicize. If you're on the right, you probably believe that all kids should start in the same place, and some kids deserve a leg up. And if you're on the left, you probably believe that all kids should finish the same place. If you're a liberal, you might believe both in the same day. That's all right. It's not my job to really tell you how to fix this or even to tell if you should fix it. As a journalist, all I do is I hold a mirror up to society, and I ask you to look into it, and I ask you, do you like what you see? So I'll tell you that yes, our land was taken of us, our means of supporting ourselves were taken to us, children were ripped out of the arms of their mothers. And sometimes I know when I say these things, people who are non-native will tell me they feel guilty. You shouldn't feel guilty. You didn't do it. It wasn't you. All of us are stuck with the same present because we're all victims of the same history. And I think it's time for that history and that journalism to come together. And that's really what I've been trying to do. So you have every right to be angry about it if you want to be, because you're stuck with it with we are. If this is not the Canada that you want, you can change it. So I leave you again with Thomas King. Take this story. It's yours. Do with it what you will. Tell friends. Do a policy intervention. Write a history book. Turn it into a news story. Or forget about it. But in the years to come, don't tell me that you would have lived your life differently if only you'd heard this story, because you've heard it now. Thank you.